Hello, my excited to introduce both our presenters. Randazzo.
The first address a topic on Bible and religion. It brought up a lot of possibilities. And one of the topics that kind of came to mind was the essential meeting that has a number of layers to it, cultural layers, and then political layers, political with a small p. That sense of politics that just involves people. And that meeting between Paul and the pillars in Galatians 2 in Jerusalem, and then the subsequent meeting in Antioch, raised a lot of interest for me. And so I pitched it as a possibility, and it went from there. What I want to do today, and with this paper, is and what I wanted to do was introduce the possibility of looking at those incidents and those meetings from a political standpoint, and then unpacking those possibilities to consider, okay, if we consider our own standpoints and where we are today and how politics plays a role in our churches, how can the political issues, the political and cultural issues that the earliest churches dealt with, inform us about how politics and cultural issues can be addressed in our churches today? And so in order to do that, it meant having to go to the text and address the text in an exegetical manner. But it also meant having to do some theoretical work and using some hermeneutical methods where we addressed politics with a little p and said, okay, if we're considering these as meetings, how would we consider this? What are some guidelines that we can bring out of this? And then if we're applying those guidelines to our churches today, what can we learn from them? And those are the things that I'm looking to do today and to consider. And one of the touch points for why I wanted to consider this as an issue is that talking about religion and politics is a challenge still today. They are two of the things that it's still difficult to talk about among strangers. And even in our churches, it can be difficult to talk about. I'm reminded of a situation where I was invited to a Catholic high school to talk about the Pope's encyclical on the environment. And I was asked a question by one of the students during the Q&A, whether climate change was real. And I said, well, I'm a theologian, so I'll just reference, this is what the last three popes have said in regards to the moral teaching on it. And I did that, and then I got an angry email later on saying, you shouldn't have brought politics into this. And it was a striking moment for me to be like, wait a second, I quoted three popes on a moral issue at a Catholic high school, and I get an email saying, don't bring politics into the conversation. And it's a reminder of the fact that for some individuals, even theology can be too political when it's not the politics that they want to talk about. But the challenge is the gospel is almost always political, and the gospel has to be preached, and the gospel is almost always going to be challenging. So how can we do this when it's our calling, when it's our obligation to preach the gospel, and as John Chrysostom says, to comfort those who are uncomfortable and to make uncomfortable those who are comfortable. So I took a look at Galatians 2 and started walking through these different pieces. And the first layer I wanted to look at in the first section was to consider the tension that exists in between Paul and the pillars, which isn't always addressed. And I needed to do that to be able to look at that tension, and then to be able to then walk through and say, okay, now that we can see this tension, let's see what else is going on. And then after that, we can then talk about where that tension takes us and then where it goes from there. In particular, where it takes us from there and into how it can help us to understand our churches today. So let's talk about what we have in chapter 2 just right off the bat. We have in Galatians, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets with Peter and James, John, and also there are these false brothers. Paul confronts the false brothers. He says he does not yield to them. And then the pillars seem to side with Paul. At this point, there seems to be an agreement between Paul and the pillars, and the phrase that's used in 2:9 is that the pillars extend the right hand or give the right hand to Paul and Barnabas. Then in 2:11 to 14, when Peter is in Antioch with Paul, and the people from James arrive in Antioch, Peter separates from the Gentiles when they're eating. And Paul calls him out, calls him a hypocrite in front of the community. And this upsets and causes a dispute in the community. Paul seems to feel betrayed, and even Barnabas seems to side with Peter in this situation. And Paul ends up being left to his own position. Now, a lot of this is told now from a later perspective. Paul is now going to be on his own. He's going to go solo. And he'll later write to the Galatians, to these communities after the fact. But when he's writing to them, and when he's writing to them, he's going to be writing from his own perspective. That limits our perspective, and it limits our ability to with our resources and with our textual resources. But we're going to be able to engage these resources and take a look at them and say, okay, so based on what we have, how can we engage these resources and consider what the relationships were between Paul and the pillars, and what he was trying to communicate to the Galatians. And we can see in this basically 4 different encounters. We can see Paul and the pillars in Jerusalem, the first with the false brothers, and then Paul and the pillars with the right hand. We can see Paul and the pillars in Antioch. And then we can consider Paul's letter to the Galatians themselves as its own pastoral event. In the next section, what I want to do is consider the context of those events And I want to get into the the terms that are used here to unpack a little bit that relationship between Paul and the pillars. As I mentioned in the paper, some of this research comes from some work that I'm co-authoring on what we call Paul's campaign rhetoric. What Paul's utilizing here seems to be rhetoric that he's basically is picking up from military language. It's not surprising that he uses military language, 8 terms, in fact, 8 military terms and phrases that he uses just in those short 14 verses. It's not surprising that he uses military terms against the false brothers. That's not surprising at all. That makes sense. There is antagonists. What's more surprising is that he also uses military language with the pillars. He uses it, the right hand of fellowship, for example, is a term that's used whenever somebody is basically saying, I'm not going to hurt you now, or I'm not going to harm you now. We normally gloss it over with the right hand of fellowship. And a lot of scholars, whenever they're commenting on Galatians 2, will sometimes gloss over the phrase and sometimes not really treat the antagonism that might be there between Paul and the pillars appropriately. But there is an antagonism that's there that is underscored by this military language that's in the text. And it's there in 2:1 through 10, and it's also there considerably in 2:1 through 14. And in 2:4, you have parasaktos, parasarkomai, and kataskapeo. Then in 2:4 to 5, you have katadulao, meaning to enslave, and echo, meaning we did not yield. Then you have to give the right hand, that's in 2:9 to 10. To oppose to the face in 2:11 is also antistemi kata prosopon, is also a military phrase. And then sunapago is very consistently a military phrase. So you have 8 consistent military phrases utilized not only with the false brothers, but also with the pillars. In these cases, it appears that Paul is significantly trying to indicate to the Galatian audience that it's not just the false brothers that he sees as being military or as being combatants, but it's the pillars as well that he sees as being military combatants as well. It also indicates, because of the right hand of fellowship, it indicates that this relationship itself, because the right hand of fellowship indicates that an end to hostility, it indicates that the relationship had been marked by hostility beforehand. And that Paul felt that the pillars were the initiators of the hostility, and that the pillars had basically said, okay, we're going to stop this for now. But then Paul felt that in Antioch, the hostilities had been reinitiated. And basically, he had been betrayed. So in taking that context and that understanding of this, and Paul seeing a tension between himself and the pillars, that's worthwhile to then follow from that into this next step, which is in section 3. So if Paul and the pillars had this much tension with one another over cultural and political conflicts that early on, what does that tell us? You know, as early on as in Jerusalem, as early on as in Antioch, you know, what does that tell us about our own churches? The first thing it tells us is that we shouldn't be surprised to see political conflict in our own churches. We shouldn't be too surprised to find that politics is going to be there. and politics in the sense that we're going to have political issues that come up, and in terms of the topics that are going to be there, or that the politics, the small p politics, how people interact in our pastoral communities, in our committees, and other things like that. We shouldn't be surprised to see those things either. Part of this is because politics is basically people. Politics is the culmination of people in their lives. It's their narratives, their fears, their hopes, their conflicts. It's all of that wrapped up together. And you can see that in particular in Galatians 2. So what I wanted to do in looking at that then was to take those considerations and to reevaluate those meetings in Galatians 2 with that in mind, and to say, okay, so considering these as meetings and with an understanding of politics with a small p, how are these meetings unfolding? And the first thing I wanted to look at was the pillars as an authoritative body. The first thing that they wanted to do was they had an outsider basically say, I want to meet with you. And so they have an authority to be able to set the agenda, to be able to determine who's there. And one of the things I noticed is that just the fact that the false brothers are there is a significant event. It upset Paul, just the fact that the false brothers were there. But that's the thing about meetings. Meetings are political just by who's there. And there's the old saying in Texas, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And in this case, just the fact that the false brothers, in Paul's view, was at the table and Paul wasn't there alone was a problem for him. It meant he didn't have an individual audience with the pillars, which was a knock against his credibility. But it also meant that he had to contend or had a counter voice to his position when he was trying to present his gospel. Now, to the pillars side, this gives a little bit of a buffer. It not only allows the fact that they have a witness to be able to offer any counter to the fact that they have this outsider upstart coming in and presenting a voice, but it also avails the chance that what if they didn't want to give their opinion? What if they share the false brother's opinion? It allows the false brothers, it allows them to speak through the false brothers and then still appear magnanimous whenever they give their position or whenever they give their final voice, if they ended up siding with the false brothers. That's not the direction it went. What they end up doing was siding with Paul. But it is surprising at this point in Paul's retelling that Titus, the major focus of that discussion, was not required to be circumcised. He was not required to be circumcised at that point, but there's no blanket declaration at this time by the pillars about any other Gentile at this point. It's just Titus. If there had been a blanket declaration, this would be a key time to mention it. But there is no mention of it. So it is a victory for Paul, certainly in some sense, but in other senses, it's just a punt down the road. There's not a lot of sense here. So on some levels, one could say that the pillars are putting on a clinic in terms of administrative meeting craft. They are trying to remain magnanimous or trying to appear magnanimous. They're bringing in an outside body, bringing in a friendly body to be able to serve as a check. But there are some challenges here. After all, this is also too authoritative centric. Paul, however, has gained a lot. He was an outsider who's now much further inside. He has a foot in the door, and as an outsider, that elevates his status. There are positives to this model, but there are also a number of negatives. The authorities have too much control over the agenda, and the end is much more focused on a zero-sum battle. Paul's techniques are also very problematic. The next event is not much better. Whenever they decide about splitting up the mission fields at the extending of the right hand, there's a problem with terminology and decisions. This is whenever they're extending the right hand, deciding about who will go in what direction. There's a question here about what do they mean by that? Does this mean that if Peter's in charge of the Jews and Paul's in charge of the Gentiles, how is that understood? Because does that elevate Paul to the stature of the pillars? Also, if Peter's in charge of the Jews and Paul's in charge of the Gentiles, that's a huge area. And that doesn't really seem to be very balanced in that regard. So there's a great deal of terminology that is problematic here. Again, this is in Paul's telling, but the communication here is problematic. The language is problematic, and also the expectations are not very realistic. The resolutions are not realistic here at all. Even if these were put forward in good faith, what about communities that are both Jewish and Gentile? Who has authority or jurisdiction over those? That's not really addressed here. And of course, there are questions about this text that exist, and I'm fully aware, but the challenge remains, it's in the text, and the challenge remains, how do we address that issue? So just right after this event, we have a mixed community in Antioch that brings this vagueness of language right to the fore. And then, of course, there's the challenge of money. Paul has this comment of, which I wanted to do anyway, regarding collecting money. And it demonstrates the fact that, of course, he wanted to collect money, but he didn't want to make it look like he was told to collect money. He didn't want to make it look like it was contractual. Nobody wants to make it seem like it was an obligation for them to collect money or to do something good. And so it's one of those indications where even in politics, charity can sometimes be a casualty. Antioch becomes the next scenario where we have to indicate the next big issue. And that is the theatrics that can sometimes become into political power plays. Paul makes possibly a critical consideration here. He considers that challenging Peter would be a very persuasive move. The challenge, though, is that whatever it was that he said, and it's not clear what he said, but whatever it was, it's not necessarily that people thought that he was wrong, but whatever it was that he said or how he said it, even individuals as close to him as Barnabas felt either that what he said or how he went about saying it was so counterproductive or so problematic that they ended up backing away from him and siding with the other position. And this can be an example of how, unfortunately, the medium can get away from the message. And even worse, the messenger can sometimes eclipse the message. And that or when the ambition of the messenger can sometimes eclipse the substance of the message. And that's something that we must always be wary of. Paul, in this case, perhaps missed out on an opportunity to do it in a different or better way. Finally, we have to consider what to do about the letter to the Galatians. And I recognize that this is a challenging consideration. Galatians, of course, is considered one of the greatest, a fantastic work in Western civilization. It's foundational for the Reformation. There's no question that Augustine loved it. There's no question that Luther found it as necessary. But when we consider it in its own time for its own situation, there's a lot to consider it as being ineffective for its own pastoral conditions. When we think about where it's going to and what it did for its own audience, we have to consider that it might not have impacted or might not have affected what it needed to do for that audience. From a pastoral level, did it do what it needed to do for that group? And it might not have. Its impact certainly has been significant later on. Before that group, we have to consider what did it do pastorally for that group. And based on the historical evidence of that time, it appears that Paul did lose those churches. And so pastorally, its effect for that time was less than satisfactory. Which raises the question then, what does that tell us on a pastoral level for politics today? And what we can do about politics today. So these are some of the takeaways that I have from this. The first one is that people are political, and that we're going to have to address the conflicts in our churches in one way or another. We're going to have to, the individuals that are coming to our churches, we should give them bread, not milk. And we're going to have individuals that are going to come in and say, I'm not really interested in politics. Or they might come in and say, I don't really want to hear about political issues. But that could also be a great gateway to ask them, okay, why this topic? Why is this topic something that you didn't want to hear about? What is the topic you do want to hear about? And that's a gateway to having a conversation rather than a conflict. It could be that this individual, it's not that they don't want to hear about politics, they're just interested in a different topic. And they might end up being a very engaging individual just on a different topic. The other thing that's significant is that communication is key, both in your pastoral teams and with your communities. You have to be able to communicate on a regular basis and be able to know, what did we agree on? Did we agree on those things? And are we continuing to agree on that language so that everyone is on the same page and you all know what is going on? The other thing that's important is that public theatrics make for bad politics, but even worse pastoral care. Politics do not benefit well, and especially whenever you're doing political theology. There's no question that individuals that often do pastoring and do ministry have a flair for the theatrical. They like, it's one of the things that drives them. But when theatrics intersect with politics, a lot of times you end up getting into the Elijah complex, where you're looking for the big CGI effects that's going to turn people quickly. But when you do that too much, as soon as the adrenaline goes away, people are just looking for the next sugar fix. And that's not what the gospel calls us to. The gospel calls us to a good, sustained metanoia. And in order to maintain that, you have to be able to give people good bread, nutrients to be able to sustain the journey. And that can be more difficult. But what it requires is discipline and less theatrics. Lastly, or not quite lastly, the flock suffers when shepherds fight. So be careful when your ministry team differs. Be careful when you or other ministers are in dispute. But when you are in dispute, that can be a lesson in terms of how you resolve it. And then lastly, your politics or your own views are not supposed to be the focus. People are going to be searching for a signal during these difficult times. But the signal isn't you. The signal is the gospel. And if you can amplify that, fantastic. But it's not supposed to be about you. The goal is to be able to amplify the gospel substantially and effectively so that those around you can receive that message that does challenge them and gives them a perspective that gets to see the world differently. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and the response, Dr. Randazzo. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Milinovich. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Randazzo for about 10, 12 minutes of response, and we'll go from there. Over to you, Dr. Randazzo.
Thank you. Wanted to thank specifically Dr. Edwards for inviting me to this panel. Would like to thank Dr. Milinovich for a wonderful paper. I have read the paper and he summarized it, and there is so much more going on in that paper itself, and I recommend that you actually read it when you get a chance. One final note, despite having gotten my doctorate several years ago, I still get a tiny little thrill of joy when someone calls me Dr. Randazzo. Gives me, makes me feel a little better about things. Okay, so I wanted to actually start off by saying it would be an understatement to say that I resonate with Dr. Milinovich's warning about the topics to be avoided in pleasant company: politics, religion, and sex. I often state that as a political theologian, two of these topics are literally my job, which can make dinner parties somewhat complicated, to put it mildly. When I add on to the fact of the physical presentation that often accompanies my non-binary gender identity, I far too often find that I am a walking embodiment of everything which tends to cause offense in what some might term polite society. It is from this social location that I speak, asking the challenging question, what actually is political? The question can be dismissed as simply a minor semantic game, with the assumption that whatever definition one holds is the most inherently obvious one. Yet, as Milinovich argues, our definition of this word foregrounds our entire conceptual framework, establishing the boundaries of acceptability and necessity across potentially the entire scope of human interaction, from our understanding of justice to economics, and even to our conceptions of the human person. Again, an issue of which I am rather painfully aware. This is not a minor concern, dismissed as mere partisan bickering or deal-making. I'd argue that the sweep of the biblical tradition assumes the existence of a divine being intimately engaged with the fundamental questions of human existence, often with a very clear intent towards which this being would care to frame the human experience. In that vein, therefore, God is inherently and unavoidably political. So concomitantly, the biblical witness must be as well. By limiting our understanding of the political to simply the actions of parties, we actually run the risk of failing to comprehend the gospel itself. Moving even farther, we cannot simply bracket the political out from our understanding of and approach to the issues of personal pastoral concern, which are so often the core aspect of the lives of our church communities. As that old canard states, the personal is political, unavoidably so. Our congregants' ability to access, or lack of ability, as is often the case, the healthcare they require is an inherently political question, as are not only the potential reasons behind the vast differentials of access, but also the causes of the illnesses and diseases from which they suffer. While Leviticus demands that we provide for the needs of the poor, the widows, and the orphans, it also demands that we continuously right the injustices which cause the poverty and alienation which create the populations from which we are then called upon to serve. I need not belabor this point any further, save to insist that when we make efforts to not cause conflicts within our congregation so as to not diminish the pastoral benefits that religious community, ritual, and teaching can offer, under the fear that discussing likely contentious and challenging issues may cause rifts, we risk simply offering a Band-Aid when what is actually required is a surgeon. We do not create rifts when we address the lived reality of our congregations. We simply uncover the rifts and conflicts which were already extant. Therefore, I truly appreciate Milinovich's fierce, and I'd argue vitally necessary, intervention here with the interpretive tradition of Galatians 2, 1 through 14. I especially appreciate his deft dismantling of the interpretive tradition, which has sought to view the right hand of fellowship in 2:9 as an inherently amicable or even friendly gesture, which is then used as the main lens through which to interpret the entire conflict itself. As Milinovich insists, this reading ignores the rather strident and even sarcastic tone which colors Paul's relation of this series of events, which, due to the timing of the writing of this letter after the events which Paul describes, would at the very least speak to a rather less than amicable relationship between Paul and the pillars. Milinovich carefully builds his argument by asking us to imagine the events as they occurred, offering some intriguing ways to set the scene in our mind's eye, and then asks us to consider whether the traditional reconciliatory interpretation actually holds any water. Through a very careful reading of the text, he presents what I find to be a rather persuasive argument that not only must we not ignore the rather militaristic framing Paul ascribes to this series of incidents, and thus to what can only be understood to be his own ferocious response to the actions of the spies and the betrayers, but that we must reassess Galatians in the light of conflict and human frailty and begin to learn the lessons it teaches us about how to approach conflict in our communities. At this point, I must confess that I feel rather marked by my own methodological, theological, and ecclesiastical commitments which necessarily frame my response to this paper. I have served in parish ministry for many years, and I have training in both the practice and theology of peacemaking, particularly in situations of inter-Christian conflict. I am also a political theologian who spends a great deal of time considering the biblical witness from the lens of applying its lessons and teachings to issues of political import, especially peacemaking, reconciliation, and eco-theology. It is from that perspective that I can offer my own response to the theses put forth in this paper. Simply put, I find Milinovich's 5 lessons, which he gathered from the series of conflicts in Galatians 2, both insightful but also puzzling. 1, people are political. As I've already mentioned above, this claim seems to not only be absolutely true, but nigh on obvious, almost to the point that it is so foundational that it is akin to air, water, and food. It just is. Actually, I'd argue that the very fact that Milinovich felt compelled to not only mention this, but to spend a great deal of space exploring this argument demonstrates that it is akin to a core truth of the human condition. Because isn't it true that we tend to forget those things which are so consistent and foundational, they become the furniture of our lives? This then begs the question, how do we effectively foreground the truth that politics simply are without falling into the trap of minimalist definitions of politics? 2, communication is key. This is another truth that is so foundational that it is actually somehow slipped into the realm of cliche. The absolute tragedy of this is that we seem to be singularly incapable of remembering this simple truth, that we actually need to talk to each other in order to ever hope to be understood. One point I do feel compelled to mention, however, is that communication is not an inherently beneficial good. One can just as easily communicate manipulatively as communicate truthfully. Milinovich helpfully points out the possibility that Paul's emotional state could quite easily have impacted his ability to present the most accurate and truthful account of the events which transpired, and as the paper notes ruefully, Paul's gloss on the event very likely closed off doors for a future relationship with his community in Galatia and may have caused permanent damage to the relationship between Paul, Galatians, and Antioch. John Paul Lederach, one of the foremost theorists in post-conflict reconciliation and peacemaking, claims that reconciliation is the place which exists at the point where peace, justice, mercy, and truth all meet. As Milinovich notes, the multiple failures of everyone in this incident demonstrate a general lack of mercy, justice, and most unfortunately, truth amongst all involved. As we have so painfully been reminded recently, silencing the truth, even if out of a concern for comfort, ultimately poisons our witness and simply ensures the continued presence of injustice, sometimes at the very heart of Christianity. I wonder, is Milinovich being too harsh on Paul here, as he seemed to fervently believe that he needed to right what he understood to be an injustice? What is the role of the angry expression of righteous truth? And how do we determine that we are actually seeking justice and not just personal relief? 3, goes on from that and relates to my own Quaker place, my own Quaker tradition. Milinovich makes an argument about how we should avoid public theatrics and that it makes for bad politics and potentially even worse pastoral care. And yet I'm reminded of some incidents that emerged from the early time of Quakerism, which were not only strident and theatrical, but they made a big difference. So here in New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey, there was a guy named Benjamin Lay, who was a member of a community here, and then he moved over to Philadelphia. And there was one time when he sought to express the absolute core of his witness about the sinfulness of slavery and Quakers' role in, shall we say, making slavery possible. So he walks into the meeting house, grabs a bag full of pokeberry juice, which is basically very red. And he stands up and he says, "This is what you are doing to the heart of God when you are holding slaves." Takes a knife, stabs that bag, and the juice goes everywhere, literally covering everyone in the meeting in red juice. Okay. Now, of course, unfortunately, Benjamin Lay got read out of his meeting and they went, "See you later." You know, the old form of canceling. But today, we look at Benjamin Lay as a prophet. We look at Benjamin Lay as someone who said what needed to be said in the moment. And actually, in his time, he inspired people like John Woolman, who is an incredibly well-known Quaker, who is a prophet for abolition. Now, John Woolman was slightly less theatrical than Benjamin Lay. It's kind of hard not to be. Study Benjamin Lay. He did some amazingly prophetic things, but Woolman would literally not wear any clothes that were dyed. He would never walk. He would never use a horse when he could walk instead, because using a horse would put pressure on the horse and would also, would place demands on the oftentimes slaves who were required to take care of the horses themselves. He would not write wills that were that would ever continue someone's enslavement after somebody passed on. He made very performative gestures that were necessary interventions to prove the point of justice. So I wonder, what is the role of the prophetic in Milinovich's understanding of this? 4, the flock suffers when the shepherds fight. The challenge that Milinovich offers here is that once shorn of our understandable desire to agree with the giants of our theological history, Augustine in particular, that the founders of our religious tradition were generally in theological agreement, we might actually allow the power of another interpretation to take root. That conflict is baked into the very fabric of our tradition, and that even the apostles weren't in agreement about the way the gospel should be understood, interpreted, and applied. And finally, perhaps most heretically, that maybe such conflict is not only okay, but core to the gospel. Another connection I find with my Quaker tradition is that the rituals of our communities can often serve to paper over conflict. while they might offer a temporary solution to conflict by giving us the ability to engage in our work and not actually talk to each other about what we believe, what that winds up happening is that the truth of the conflict will continue to fester underneath. We can keep going on as the rituals demand, living our lives, and never actually talk to each other about the conflict itself. So within the community, within the heart of the community, we have this acid that is just eating away, while on the outside it seems perfect. In my mind, this is whited sepulchres. So how would we respond to the necessity to actually push through and speak the truth in our communities while also trying to be pastoral? And finally, the idea that it should never be about you, the pastor. And on this point, I can definitely agree. The leadership of the church must insist on not imposing their own personal perspectives on the congregation. The leader is, well, the pastor is a leader. And thus, as we note, and Milinovich notes in his paper, power dynamics play a significant role in how we engage in questions of power and truth, particularly in our churches. And yet, I would take this in a slightly different direction by making the statement that by necessity and design for every Christian, the gospel must be our primary perspective and never another ideological framework. While parties, economic ideologies, all manner of other things might obviously inform and shape our perspectives on political issues, again, insisting on this most generous definition of politics, the gospel must be the foundation upon which we rest. Yet here's the fundamental definition of politics. Here's the fundamental challenge, sorry. As I stated above, the Christian biblical witness is irretrievably, inextricably, unavoidably political and demands that we align ourselves to its politics. If the personal is political, then inherently the political is personal. Is Milinovich actually calling on us and on our pastors to strive to remove our persons from the political? It is on this point that I find myself most puzzled, particularly as someone, again, whose very presentation winds up being a political act. So for those people who, because of racial issues, because of economic issues and the way they look and what they can dress, how they can dress, the ways they are in the world, are they to remove politics from who they are? Is that even possible? On that note, I wanted to, again, state, I found this paper to be extremely interesting, moving, and I'm going to take a very different look at Galatians moving forward. So thank you very much, Dr. Milinovich, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dr. Randazzo. And first, I'll turn it back to Dr. Milinovich if he has any responses to the response. It gets really meta at this point. And then we will
Sure.
And then we'll take some of the questions that have been presented. So, Dr. Milinovich.
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you so much, Dr. Randazzo. That was amazing, and it was a really wonderful response. Great points, all fantastic points and comments. If it's okay with you, I'll be in contact with you about those points because those were
Absolutely.
great.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot to take from those. Some of those are just great points in terms of things that I need to tighten up, because I think there are some of those points were things that I definitely agree with. And so it's just a matter of me wanting to say the things in a better way to clarify them. To the point about the communication, or to about the pastors, you have a very good point about the pastors. When the flock, or when the shepherds fight, because you're absolutely right that if shepherds are fighting, the flock will still suffer if they aren't fighting externally, but the bile is still there. So that definitely needs to be addressed. You're absolutely right. And to your last point, no, absolutely, the political cannot be separated from the personal. And so that's definitely not what I'm asking to do. So the key is then for me to find a way to articulate better, that so that the paper is not implying that at all. But I really appreciate your comments, and I'm glad that you liked it. I'm glad that you appreciate Galatians in a new way, and yeah, that I was moved by your response. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
So we have a few questions here first. First one comes from Carl Lindbergh, who's a student at the seminary. Thank you for your paper and presentation. I enjoyed seeing how the early church was able to engage in difficult conversations. Are there any other early church documents outside of Paul's letters and Acts that mention the practices that Paul and other early church leaders practiced that were successful, or practices that they engaged in to better communicate and converse with their congregations around political issues? I know you said that Paul ended up losing a couple of churches. Are there similar accounts from the early church?
I mean, you could look at some of Paul's other letters as examples of more successful events, where, like, 2 Corinthians is a letter where he did hold on to churches, and you could look at Romans as a letter where maybe he learned from Galatians. That would be my primary response right off the bat, before going to later examples. But I think those are examples where even within this small circle, you have, even with the same individuals, you have lessons learned and individuals writing there and saying, okay, that didn't work, or perhaps that didn't work, so I'm going to try to say it in a different way now.
Thanks. Another question from Eduardo Sales de Lima. First of all, he wanted to thank you for the presentation. He wonders about your the paragraph about relevance for today.
Okay.
That he wonders if it lacks foundation. For example, he quotes, he insults his audience. Is Paul, or he shoots. Is Paul really doing this? Does the text allow this interpretation? Is the confrontation not due to Jewish hermeneutics based on dialogue and confrontation as interpretive processes? Another example, like this is him saying, another example I quote, it depends a lot on emotion, and they choose Christ and tradition over Paul's angry rhetoric. Was Paul really
Sure.
angry? Could the narrative be presenting response to a betrayal situation? So.
Sure. Sure. Is there a way is that in the chat?
Yes.
It just might be helpful for me to see his comment.
Absolutely.
Is that the second one?
It's the first one on the top. Can you see that? I can.
At 3:13 p.m. it's labeled.
Okay. Was Paul really angry? Could the narrative be presenting a response to a betrayal situation so far from Paul? Oh, okay. Was Paul really angry? I mean, there doesn't seem to be much disagreement in the scholarship that Paul was angry. As a matter of fact, most individuals will, many commentators will ascribe Paul's position and the way that he phrases things in Galatians to Paul's anger. So that seems to be fine. In terms of saying that, my conclusions are problematic, that's fine. Right? That saying that you don't agree with my conclusions, that's fine. But the position that Paul was angry, that's pretty much that's pretty standard. As far as Paul's anger impacting in that particular paragraph, I understand that it's a challenge on many levels to question Paul, and especially whenever you're getting to that position and saying, well, in that sentence, and so, yeah, I can take your position on that, but but I think Paul's anger does come through in a number of levels. There is no blessing at their Thanksgiving at the beginning of this letter. The military language that's throughout it. He calls them, "Oh, you stupid Galatians." There's a lot of pieces here where he's angry and seems to have to collect himself. So that would have come through. He does call on the opponents to mutilate themselves. There's some anger there.
Okay, another question from Nathaniel Rodriguez, who's a current seminary student. And you'll see it at 319 if you're looking. Thank you for the presentation. You wrote that Paul's gospel is not exactly free of Jewish customs. He's still requiring ethical vigilance, sexual morality, and avoidance of things like idolatry and witchcraft that certainly sound familiar to Jewish legal traditions. But is it even possible to divorce some Jewish legal traditions from Christ's ethical teachings? What to make of its relationship with natural law?
Oh, natural law. Wow. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where to take that question at this point, but I love the question. I want to be very clear. I think what the student is asking, because I'm looking at it now, some Jewish legal teachings from Christ's ethical teachings. So I understand what you're saying in terms of, is there going to be, are some things going to look Jewish, or are some things going to appear Jewish if it's Christian? And so I understand that. And so is it going to, are some ethical precepts going to look
There we go.
on the one hand, I think that I understand that, oops.
You just,
sorry,
you just tweaked out there for about 20 seconds. So you're back now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I answered the question fully during that time. So
Love it. Love to see it.
Isn't that always the way?
No, I think that it's a great question. The challenge that we have with Paul is, because it's a great point. What we have with Paul is that when you look at how he's addressing his opposition, what I'm trying to bring up there is that in context with his opposition, he's challenging his opponents for upholding the law, and that he's not having the law and it's just grace. And then when he's telling his communities what to do, it looks a lot like the Jewish law. And so while one could say, oh, those are just reasonable customs or reasonable things to do, it raises the question of, well, is Paul really doing something different? Or is what he was doing just rebranding of himself and branding of his opposition? And so it raises that challenge. And so that's what I was trying to bring up there. So you're absolutely right, there is going to be some Jewishness that's going to come along. But then if that's the case, then Paul is basically contradicting himself. Because he says that if you take on the law, then Christ is of no use to you. So if they're going to be taking on the law no matter what, whenever they take on the Christian faith, then he's already putting himself into a problematic situation. And I think that it's the challenge is that his rhetoric is so extreme. And I think partially because of whether it's because of his anger or just because of the conflict he's involved with, but he's kind of boxed himself in because of his rhetoric, and the rhetoric doesn't always add up to the conflict or the campaign rhetoric that he's utilizing. That's a great question.
One more question so far, at least. It's a very practical question then from Eric Staley, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How should leaders address each other then when they disagree with each other? Specifically, I would think in the church.
Yeah. Very carefully. I mean, we have this happen all the, I've had this happen in a number of different situations. You know, in either in email exchanges or in person. I'm the chair of a committee with 4 deans on it at Dominican. It's a faculty committee, but then there are 4 deans on it and a number of VPs and other things like that. And it can get really difficult because it's the curriculum committee. It can be really difficult when you're chairing that committee of, so if I have to cut somebody off and they're a VP, how do I do that? Or if people are disagreeing, how do I tell them to calm down? And it can be really difficult when it comes down to protocol. And so it just comes down to having rules in place and having an understanding. I think like Dr. Randazzo said, not just communicating, but also having an awareness that communication can go wrong. And that communicating is great, but that there are times where that communication can be wrong. So have rules for communicating and have rules for an understanding for, okay, when this goes wrong or when this happens, we're going to go take this to this other person. And this other person is going to be able to decide this. Knowing expectations or having expectations or guidelines, I feel is one of the best ways to do that. Because surprises are what cause anxiety. So that's what I find to be the best way to deal with that, especially when it's your own team. When it's your own team, that's as long as you're all on the same page, you can handle just about any given situation. That's a very good question.
Have right now, unless others have come in recently, but are there any other thoughts from either of you, Dr. Randazzo or Dr. Milinovich? Want to continue the conversation?
Yeah, actually, I would love to dive a little bit more into this this sort of issue that you bring up about the challenge of being performative in one's engagement. In part because of the fact that again, coming from a tradition where the construct of the prophetic was so foundational to the beginning of who we were, that even now to this day, there is a sense of a Quaker acting prophetically in some form or fashion is seen as a valid expression of ministry. The challenge is, of course, is that, you know, we have someone, again, like Benjamin Lay, who was speaking prophetically, acting prophetically, John Woolman acting prophetically. And then you have someone named James Naylor, who was a exceedingly famous, very well-known Quaker for many, many years, until he reached a tipping point where he actually walked into the city gates of Bristol astride a donkey, and he was making a statement about himself as sort of, you know, I am walking in at some sense as the Messiah. And that, of course, sort of, you know, created a whole culmination of events, this whole cascade, which led to, in typical, you know, mid 17th century fashion, he had a B for blasphemer, you know, branded into his head, and he had his tongue cleaved in two. And he was incredibly chastened by the experience, and Quakers generally were chastened by that, because the king decided to start pushing back a little against their, you know, prophetic witness. So there's this, you know, which then sort of in some sense helped lead towards about 100 years of quietism amongst Quakers, where we just weren't as prophetic. So that balance where we're trying to say truth, where we're trying to push into the realm of truth. Paul specifically, where he's trying to walk this delicate balance, like you talked about, between like, how can I walk this political statement between having no power, but also feeling like I have the power of this revelation, walking in front of these pillars, knowing that I have this absolute call to speak to the uncircumcised, and that there's a necessary call for that. And yet there is this tradition, there are those in power who would specifically reject that. So how does Paul walk that line? Unfortunately, when it comes down to it, he winds up, going 3 rounds about where we put tables, which might not be the best use of his prophetic witness. But that question of how are we prophetic? How can we be prophetic within our congregations is something that, particularly in the last 2 years, we've really seen hit us home. Not yet, not just with the protests and the George Floyd protests from last summer, but also our current moment where we're protesting the very idea of wearing a mask or something along those lines. So this question of performance, I want you to sort of maybe dive into that a little bit more, because I feel like there's some stuff there, particularly with him maybe overstepping with Peter and the whole, like, where do we put tables? But that he was onto something. There was this the sense that Peter was actually being hypocritical, and how can one walk that line? So I was wondering if you could sort of build on that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really appreciate your point in your response about this, and it brought up it reminded me of the fact that I think one of the challenges I had when I was writing this, because I felt this pressure when I was writing that section. I made the mistake of generalizing too much. And there's always a caveat, right? You always got to leave room for caveats. And so I should have said most or something to that effect, because you're absolutely right. There are examples. And of course, the Christian prophetic witness is a great example. And the Old Testament prophetic witness. But there are great examples of the prophetic witness that have had impact. So we got to leave room for that. It's very rare that it works well.
True.
So, and I don't know what the statistics are, but so I haven't seen it work effectively recently. I guess that's why I put it the way I did. But you've got a very good point. It can be done well, and so that is something to amend in the paper. I think it brings up a good point about Paul, that you're absolutely right. His point was correct. Like he had a point. The question was how to go about it, and the fact that I also have no problem with the fact that he wanted to speak up about it, and I think that's worthwhile. The challenge is how to go about it. And that's a different conversation, right? I think that when it comes to the prophetic witness or how he goes about it, I guess how he could have done it, could have been to not make it. His challenge was he tried to make it about him and his gospel in a public setting, and he tried to make it a zero-sum game, like where he's like, okay, this is where I prove I'm right, and I think that was where it went wrong. And it went wrong in a couple of reasons. Number one, the focus was on him. That wasn't just bad for his gospel, that was bad for him too. If he was wrong, that meant he lost. And so he needed a better campaign manager to kind of be like, no, this might not work out, Right. And so he needed somebody to work with him on that. So I think that's one of the situations where I think operating a little bit better. And maybe this is why, maybe he did talk with Barnabas about it and said, I know what we need to do. We need to confront Peter on this. And Barnabas is like, you're out of your mind. We're not doing that. And then Paul did anyway. Maybe, maybe there are different things that took place in that setting. And Paul, that's when Paul went solo. I don't know. But he felt that was absolutely the way he had to do it. But going about it differently, by not emphasizing himself would have been the first step. And I think by focusing on getting a team together, working with Barnabas, working with others in the community, talking more with Peter and saying, okay, what could we do that's different? Waiting until James as Peter left and said, okay, that happened. Now, how can we keep from that happening ever again? Like, there are certain things that you can do so that it is not, you can take the emotion out of it. You can make it less of a crisis event. And you can make it less about you and make it more about the message and more about the people in the community.
I think that, and I mentioned in my response that that focus on rooting ourselves continuously in the gospel, it doesn't give us cover, it gives us rooting. And I think rooting is this key sort of metaphor here, in that once you're rooted, it's kind of hard to pull you out. And you can grow in any number of different directions. You might, as a tree, even if the wind is blowing, you might be shifted, but you're not going anywhere. You're in that ground. So if we root our actions within the gospel, then we're there. The challenge then, though, is I guess, how do we wrestle with conflicts about what is in fact the gospel? And this is something that I didn't include in the paper, but your words kind of brought up this concept of when I was looking at the idea of the pillars arguing with Paul, and the sense in my mind, I've always felt Augustine just really not wanting to have his parents fight. He wanted to have everyone be able to get on just fine, and no one's arguing over the dinner table or what have you. There's a sense of there's this sense that our witness must be unified, which challenges me, because the text literally has 4 different gospels for a reason. There are 2 different creation stories in Genesis. There's a reason for that. So the sense of diversity is inherently valued. So I wonder if we're engaging with this question of how do we avoid not being sort of conflictual inherently. I wonder how much of our understanding of what is inherently conflictual in some churches is actually more a cultural question and not a gospel question. So I'm thinking particularly of a lot of cultures so are marked by this, one could call this WASP, white Anglo-Saxon avoidance of active aggression, which then just winds up feeding into a very active employment of passive aggression. So we're still being aggressive, we're just calling it something different. So this aversion to anger so that any expression of anger winds up getting basically lumped with rage, and then basically anything that is anger is basically sinful and bad. Which then I would say the prophetic tradition, other expressions, other cultural understandings of Christianity would say anger is necessary, because anger in some sense is a gift. That which you are angry about might be that which is truly unjust. And how do we, if we are the gospel, if we are trying to embody the gospel in an unjust world, anger in some sense points us and clarifies our understanding. So in some sense, how do we determine what is actually just culture and what is really gospel?
Yeah, that's always going to be the challenge. It's going to differ by community to community, and can differ by week to week. Like as the community changes, the community grows. This is one of the things that I bring up a lot in my classes in terms of what we value in terms of, what's dogma, what's doctrine, what's discipline, what's custom, and those can vary, and even individuals can value those different faith traditions and faith categories differently. And it can really be difficult, because you're absolutely right. There can be individuals that that will, for instance, hymns, like, what hymns are we going to sing? Changing a hymn can be a big deal. And whether one stanza or something for the national anthem is a huge deal. So anything that involves a gesture or music or anything like that, or an emotional connection, you're absolutely going to have an effect that comes along with it. So I would say you're going to have to bring, you're going to have to, like Aristotle said, you just have to know your audience, and you have to know the community and be able to talk with them openly about it, and then be able to have the expression. In terms of the performative act, the performative act has to be able to fit the community as you know them, I think. So any performer has to know their audience, and same with the prophet. And I think that just comes down to, when you're the messenger, as long as you don't step on the message as the messenger, then you're okay. If you do step on the message, then you've got to go back and reconsider, well, what could I do differently?
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And I think there is sort of some, this issue of, knowing your audience winds up presenting some really, really fundamentally subtle challenges when you are trying to push against some cultural norms that are that might inherently lead towards the capping or silencing or censoring of expressions of justice. And there's another question in there, so I'm going to go ahead and back off here and allow the moderator to take over.
Yes, here I am. So Joel Willits, who's a New Testament professor at the University, says, if we assume that Paul wrote his letter to Gentile believers in Messiah and not Jewish believers, how might that reshape how we understand Paul's language in his presentation of the Antioch incident? What is his point for telling the story for Gentiles? What does that have to do with the politics of the incident?
So it's very curious why he tells the Antioch incident for the Gentile believers. What is his goal in telling that? It's a really good question, Dr. Willits, and I appreciate that. One of the things that comes across with that narrative, it's hard to tell what he's trying to get across there, because it doesn't really connect on many levels. He moves from circumcision to food customs or eating customs, which is anticlimactic rather than climactic. So what exactly is he getting across there? It seems more addressed to talking about the pillars and his relationship with the pillars. So if he is trying to say something to the Gentile audience, I get the sense that what he's trying to communicate to the Gentile audience is, I am the one who's going to stand up for your freedom. And I did that against the false brothers in Jerusalem when the pillars were siding with the false brothers, or we're conspiring with the false brothers against you. I fought for you. I stood up for you. And then in Antioch, whenever Peter was hypocritically, stabbing me in the back, I again opposed him to the face for you. I get the sense that that's what that narrative is about. Otherwise, it's rather anticlimactic. It doesn't really make a good story unless Paul's basically trying to make the case, and this is why I'm alone now. Barnabas left, I'm alone now, and it's because I stood up for you Gentiles, and I'm your defender.
Well, I
It's a great
know.
question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Milinovich. I know you'll all dry your eyes with us ending a few minutes early, but we'll try to keep going. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and getting into the politics of the biblical text and how that relates to the political and the personal. So thank you both for a really rich conversation today. And Dr. Edwards, is there any announcements or anything that needs to be done on your end?
If you could just say that there'll be an opportunity at the very end for people to complete surveys electronically.
So you just heard it.
Oh,
You will have that opportunity. And is there another?
and
what
the
time?
next,
Yeah.
yes, the next session begins promptly at 4:20 Central Time.
Okay. So everyone, we see you back at 4:20.
Wonderful. Thank you all. It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.
Yep.